Alright, so this round I am playing against another Japanese player. Actually, if you guys don't know, I used to live there for a few years. Shou Otsuka, the guy I'm playing, he only actually started getting into chess by the time I was already like out of my way of the country, pretty much. And that's pretty impressive when you think about it, because like in the space of 3 or so years, he's pretty much reached the level he is now. Yeah, pretty insane. But nonetheless, I am playing against him. I know he's obviously a bit stronger than his rating. He drew the top seed in Indian GM in round 1. So yeah, okay, let's get right into it though. He opens e4. I play the Caro, my main opening against e4. Knight f3, and already when he played knight f3, my soul hurt a little bit because I was kind of hoping he'd go d4, d5, e5, and go for this variation, which is very rich. Probably one of the most critical lines against Caro. I have a line I want to test against it, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, he played a slightly less critical line, but one which has a bit of a boring reputation, and to be honest, I wasn't too thrilled to see on the board with d3. And the reason is that as black, if you want to win, you kind of have to take a little bit of a risk, because the main move and the most natural looking one, d takes e4, initiating the queen exchange, what you have is basically a position where, okay, maybe you're like technically equal, but white is just very solid and it's very difficult to actually win this, and you can even go wrong quite easily. For example, a lot of people go bishop g4, which is in the spirit of the Caro. You like get the light squared bishop out, you try and exchange it off, but unfortunately, this already, as has happened in many games, isn't really quite the right strategy, because now white exchanges off there with 91, their kind of bad light squared bishop. Now we get this position where long term, white is just a little bit better. It's very difficult for black to really get counterplay, and because of that, white has some ridiculous score after 91, like 75%. Or something nuts or like that. So here's one example game, by the way. I just loaded this up to show you guys how dangerous this can really be. Hope you guys can't hear the noise outside, but this is from an Indian GM, Ganguly, and you can see what he does in this game. He plays on both flanks of the board. First, the queen side, slowly expanding there, limiting his opponent's counterplay, controlling the d4 square. Continues expanding, and it brings the rook to the d file. Now expanding on the king side as well, gaining space there. Again, limiting counterplay, carving out a weak d5 square. Starts gaining space in the center, and just a really lovely endgame grind starts, executing on the queen side again, and targets a weakness again, it falls, and then he pushes his past b pawn, and resignation happened. A very lovely illustration of just how easily things can go wrong in this endgame as black if you're not careful. Like, if we looked at that game, right, like it wasn't even clear where exactly, white really went wrong. Sorry, black really went wrong rather. So technically the best move here is knight f6, and the main move for a long time has been knight d2 to try and play f3 and sort of restrict this knight. But there's a weird computer move either to go like h5, not rook g8, either like h5 or g5. Sometimes you combine them both and then sort of get counterplay on the king side to combat white's solid structure when they play f3. But they can also just go knight bd2, and this is also very solid. And the thing with these positions is that the engine always says they're equal, but if you look in the database and see the scores, white always scores like 65% or something ridiculous, which again I think really just comes down to the fact that white can sort of play forever and they're not really risking anything. So for this game, I wanted to do something a little bit more combative, you could say. I didn't really want to have the queens go off so early. I'm fine with that, but I would rather have something a little bit more rich. So one way to do that is to play queen c7, keep the queens on the board. I'm not a big fan of bishop g4, by the way, because after h3, I don't think bishop h5 is so good. I think that there's these lines of g4, and concretely it's a little bit sketchy. I forget the details, but I didn't love it. And I also don't really want to take here when this resembles very much the 4 knights Caro, sorry, the 3 knights, no, 2 knights, where black, the main line is to go bishop g4, and this is very solid for black. But I think that this is an improvement, actually, this variation, where white has moved g3 instead of knight c3, because very often, for example, we can go d4, gain a tempo on the knight on c3 in some variations. That can be quite important. But with the knight still on b1, actually, it's a little bit different, and I think that they have a lot more flexibility. They can go g3, bishop g2, castles, and then maybe put the knight on d2 instead, And I think that with the bishop here, white just kind of has a slight advantage. So with that, I'm not a big fan of bishop g4. D takes e4, I'm kind of neutral too. But to me, I kind of want to play this move queen c7, which I played in a few training games, and it's probably the move I'm most familiar with, so I decided to just play this one. And the main move is probably for white to play knight c3, put pressure on the center and force black to really make a decision. By the way, what's the idea with queen c7 to begin with? Well, if white just plays a passive move, we're going to play e5, we're going to gain space in the center, and we're going to have at least an equal game. So white, if they really want to fight for an advantage, they're going to have to do something very concrete. Knight c3 is one way of challenging that. Of course, now if we go e5, we just lose a pawn. So usually the way we do things after knight c3 is to take on e4, release the tension, but then basically say like, okay, we have this sort of slightly symmetrical pawn structure in the center, but our pawn on c6, it is restricting their knight on c3, so we're not doing too bad. And white does also have some other options, such as knight takes e4 in this position, but I don't really think this is too scary after knight f6. And let's say if white takes, well, then you get this sort of famous pawn structure where you have the doubled f pawns, but I think with like the knight on f3 and the pawn on d3, it's not really the best version for white. Maybe they don't have to take on f6, but I don't exactly think this is the scariest thing in the world. So instead of knight c3, what my opponent did, he was actually familiar with this queen c7 move, which is something I wasn't completely sure whether he would be, because whenever you play a move like queen c7, which is a bit rarer, there is always the decent chance that your opponent is just going to be completely out of book. But he sort of knew his way around. He ended up playing e takes d5, and e takes d5 alone would be a strategic mistake, because if you just continue playing slow developing moves, essentially you would maybe play d4 eventually to try and control the center. But what we have here is essentially a Caro exchange variation, which we usually get via these moves, right? And something like this. But in this variation, you know, they've spent, I don't know how many moves, but like, they spent 2 moves with the d pawn. They're basically down a tempo. The bishop is on a more passive square than d3. There's nothing really good about this variation, so they have to be careful if they play e takes d5 to follow it up correctly, which my opponent did. He played c4, and this is a very strange looking move because, well, it's just not a very common idea in many openings to like exchange off your e pawn and then like give yourself a backward d pawn. It looks very weird, but like this is sort of modern chess for you. And like if you're gonna play a move such as d3 or move 3, and black also plays something a little bit weird, you know, to fight for an advantage, you might have to sort of do things that, again, look a little bit strange to the human eye. But it makes a lot of sense, because if you think about it, right, the queen, when it's on c7, it's not really protecting d5 adequately. So if white can really challenge that sore spot, so to speak, if black isn't careful, that could really cause some real problem. But okay, for now, it's all fine. I just continued developing my knight c3, e6, again, just keeping the tension in the center. I could potentially release the tension in the center, but to be honest, this feels quite risky and unnecessary to do this. I'm essentially just getting rid of the only real defect in their position, which is the backward d pawn. So I don't want to do that. I keep it, of course, the tension. And to be honest, I didn't really remember a whole lot of theory coming into the game, because I wasn't really expecting this for one. I'd seen he had like one game in this variation a while ago, but I was like, okay, it's probably not going to happen. Lo and behold, it does happen. I had like 10 minutes to prepare. I didn't have a lot of time because this was the second game of the day, right? But you know, basically the main thing I remembered about this position is the setup that white wants to go for is they want to play g3, bishop f4, fianchetto the bishop, and get this sort of weird active piece play where the bishop also sort of helps challenge the d5 pawn in the center that black has. Another interesting move is also to go a3 and stop like in the main line this move bishop b4, because what essentially happens is in many lines black ends up winning the c4 pawn after and only after the bishop is moved from f1 and is no longer protecting this. But in general, because black is behind development, white's usually doing fine. They can maybe develop the bishop, they can castle, and it's really just a complicated position. So that was basically what I knew about the position. But then my opponent, he played something a little bit strange after some thinking, which was good in a way because he was out of book, and I guess also good because I knew that bishop e2 just didn't really align with sort of the general plan that white should be aiming for in this position, which is again going for g3, bishop f4. The bishop on this diagonal is really where it belongs, but after putting on e2, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense here. It's like a move which, okay, that's legal, but it's not really anything too amazing. So this basically gives me the freedom to develop, and like, let's say I just play knight c6, castles, bishop e7. It's not clear what white actually does, right? They don't have a clear plan. I mean, if they ever go d4, I'm probably going to take and give them the IQP, and playable position definitely, but I definitely wouldn't say that black is uncomfortable there. At least personally, I don't think that is the case. I played the bishop e7 move order. I didn't play knight c6 first. I think they're both, however, fine. However, I think that by playing bishop e7, I did give my opponent a slight kind of extra option here, where they could go knight b5 and gain the tempo on my queen. I go backwards. I could give a check, but I don't think that really leads anywhere. So queen d8 is what I do. And this is the real first moment of the game where I have to contend with a real threat of my opponents to go knight c7, and I have to decide whether that's actually worth dealing with. Most people aren't even going to ask that question. No, they're just going to play knight a6, and that's the wrong way to go about things. First of all, when your opponent makes threat, you ask yourself, what happens if I just ignore it? So the first move I was looking at was actually castles. And the idea basically now is with knight c7, this doesn't work because if I go knight h5, takes, the knight's trapped in the corner. I am down in exchange, but I'm probably going to be able to win it with b6, bishop b7. And if I get the two minor pieces for the rook, that's usually pretty good for black. So I knew though that in this position, if I did play castles, my opponent was not going to play knight c7. They're smart enough to realize that's a mistake. They also can't take on b8 and then go knight takes a7, because I then go queen a5 check, and I fork the king and knight. So you might be wondering then, like, what is the problem with castles? Just bloody play it right. But the issue with castles is that, or at least I thought the issue was that now bishop c7 is going to happen, and you might think that's just a stupid tempo, but the idea is no matter where my queen moves now, they can now take and go knight takes a7, and compared to when the queen was on d8, there's no longer any check. Sure, I can give a bishop b4 check, but I wasn't sure after king f1 that's actually a big deal, because they can always go g3, king g2, bring the knight back into the game. They are a pawn up, so I wasn't really sure this was anything to really be riding home about. But turns out actually that black is slightly better here after the following sequence. These are like the top engine moves, and I assume it's because, concretely speaking, in this position, well, one thing, there's the abstract factor where we have the opposite card bishops. So obviously when it's a middle game and there's opposite card bishops, the side who is attacking, generally speaking, has the advantage. So that could compensate, more than compensate, for the pawn deficit. But also it is difficult to defend against just simply black trying to attack the f2 pawn and take it. So while I don't exactly want to say this is beyond my ability to realize this, it was definitely a difficult moment, not super straightforward. At least to me, the castles was the right decision. So I ended up sort of chickening out and playing knight a6, which I wasn't happy to play, but I thought that was sort of what I had to do. Again, turns out I was wrong. Turns out I could castle and ignore the threat. And with this decision, things already became quite unpleasant over the next few moves, because in general what you need to understand is that, and by the way, white's just, we're both developing, they're bringing their rook to natural enough square. A3 sort of signifying they want to start pushing their queenside pawns. At least I think that was the idea. And again, the real issue with knight e6 is that, okay, we were defending the temporary threat of them bringing a piece into c7, but long term, how do we actually get it into the game? Like, if we go knight c5, we get slapped with b4. What next? It's not clear. And if we can't go to c5, I mean, like, where's it going? b8? No. c7? No. So that is really problematic. And if we can't move this knight, how do we kick this knight out? Well, we can take it. That's an idea I was considering. I'll talk about that in a moment. But because the knight's seen on a6, we can't go a6 and kick it out easily. So that's another big issue that we're sort of dealing with here. But okay, this was probably the first thing I was considering. And especially when I played bishop d7 on the last move, this was really one of my main ideas. But then in this position, I sort of had some doubts and second thoughts where I just wasn't sure about this position, where long-term white has the bishop here. I thought that would be quite annoying to deal with. They're going to like push these queenside pawns, maybe bring like a piece into c7 even. I can't easily make a pawn break. It really felt like the perfect recipe for just having a very passive position where I'm just struggling to be honest, and I thought maybe I could solve some of these issues if I had enough time to go knight e8, bishop d6, and exchange one of the bishops off, neutralizing that advantage they have with the bishop here. But I then saw like if they play quick enough with bishop c7, now my queen has an awkward decision between either going to c8 and stepping in the eye of the rook, which I kind of didn't trust, or going to e8 and then taking the e8 square away from knight, which I also didn't really like. And I felt that, you know, if queen b3, a4, long term this feels kind of a bit sketchy. The computer sort of, you know, says that I'm wrong. The computer's, you know, always does that right, but it concretely says that after, like, say a4 for example, in this position, if you go d4, then you're actually doing okay if you give up the pawn, because it's only going to be temporary. What's more important is you're creating a space for your knight to go to d5. That's a terrible arrow, but now after this, the bishop moves, you take the pawn back, and all of a sudden you're not doing too badly, because also keep in mind that pawn is quite a long-term weakness they have to deal with. Maybe we can even bring a piece into c3. I don't know, but realistically, I'm not going to be seeing like the d4 idea after all those exchanges from this position, at least not for someone of my strength. I don't think that's really happening. So while the computer does kind of have this as one of the top lines, I just felt kind of a bit iffy going for it. Maybe that was the right decision, maybe it wasn't, but what I do know is that the move I played in the game definitely was not the right decision, knight h5, where I'm trying to get the bishop off this diagonal first of all, and it works. He goes to e3, but now I have a knight on the edge of the board, and my a7 pawn is also being attacked. That's not fun. So I have to make another decision. What am I going to do about that? And I decided ahead of time, I'm going to play this move queen b8, which looks pretty swagger because I'm defending this. I'm threatening to bring a knight into f4 and attack their bishop and hopefully win the bishop here. But after g3, all of this is stopped and my pieces look idiotic. I bring a rook to d8, try and threaten, like, if they just play any random move, I can take. My opponent is smart. He sees he can avoid that with knight c3. And after knight f6, bringing the knight back to defend the pawn. My position is just bad. Like, it really is. I was thinking during the game that maybe I'm not doing too badly because it's compensated for the fact that white's pieces also aren't exactly on the best squares, I thought. But that really is only a temporary matter because, well, okay, and maybe we can even argue that is true, that their pieces are not on the best squares, but it's more so an issue of black's pieces are on even worse squares because, again, what's his knight doing? What's his queen doing? What's his rook doing? None of our pieces really make any sense and are serving any sort of productive role to society, so it's going to be a real struggle to play that sort of position. I think the engine gave this position like +1 during the game. I thought like maybe I'm slightly worse. Like, no, I was delusional. After d4, however, I actually was back in the game. This was a bit of a lucky move to see, and it's an example of a move which looks very natural, but really the way to keep the best advantage was to keep the structure weird and really play against the defects of my position, which are my terrible pieces. But d4 gives me some hope because now I can take, and previously taking was always really awkward because they would take back the d pawn, and that would sort of just help improve their structure, and my pieces would remain very restricted. However, after d4 now takes, I really have the potential to free some of my pieces up. If they take, I'm going to go like maybe b5, but maybe also knight 7, bishop c6, and start really freeing and liberating some of my pieces. In the game, we saw something actually a little bit unique though, 95, so my opponent's getting a little bit clever here, maybe too clever for his own good even, where he's delaying the capture of the pawn. The first question you might ask is what happens if b5 defending that? Of course, I have to then ask though, what if he plays bishop f3? And this is an interesting moment where a lot of people would immediately bail on the whole variation and say this is not good, but I sort of challenged that a bit. I was thinking, can I just sacrifice the exchange and play this position? Because if you look at it, they are really weak around the light squares around the king. Maybe I can like somehow swing the bishop around. I know that's a terrible arrow. I apologize for that, but we have real compensation in this position because of the light square weaknesses white has in their position. We can also firmly establish a knight on the d5 square, so there is legitimate compensation in this position. The engine, I think, also said that black was doing okay here, but it also said that my move in the game, knight c7, was completely fine. But okay, now in this position, they cannot delay the capture of this anymore, because if I get an extra move, let's say they play h3, b5, bishop f3, then I'm just playing knight d5 and I'm just a queen pawn up. So finally they take back. My opponent was considering for a bit knight takes e4, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, I think, because now I easily get the d5 square, and the knight's already on a very nice square here on e5. Bishop takes c4 makes more sense, bringing this sort of active bishop into the game. And I should also note that another reason I was sort of happy to see d4 is I thought this was kind of a good version of the IQP, and namely because like of this weakening move, let's say g3, which is usually kind of out of place for this structure. However, there's also some things that white has going for them, which again is this persisting theme of the fact that like this knight is bad, this queen is bad, this rook is non-existent in the game, and so because of that, even though structurally speaking, or like speaking from a long-term perspective, the IQP might be a weakness, it doesn't matter if I can't get my pieces in the game now, and white absolutely runs my face over. None of that stuff is going to matter. So I really have to pay attention to dealing with the very short-term problems, and if I can deal with those effectively, maybe then I can start displaying some of the perks that are associated with playing against the isolated queen's pawn. Unfortunately, in this game, I didn't do a very good job of that because I played b5, which is okay, kicking the bishop back, but I was very careless on my next move and I played a5. And what you need to think about, again, what are your opponent's ideas? Before you start trying to go out and do your own plan in the world, you need to think about what's going to be happening, what are other people going to be doing to you, right? And I wasn't really thinking about that, but if I did, I would have been thinking like, okay, white might bring a queen to f3, they might like bring their pieces over to the king side, but a very important break that I knew existed in the position was g4, but I didn't pay enough attention to it, and I really did pay the consequences for that. Because g4, g5, for example, if I'm not careful, say I waste a bunch of random moves, they're gonna then, in this position, if you want to pause the video, actually, there should be multiple good moves, but try and find at least what you think is the best move. But yeah, basically, I think if you just sack on h7, Greek skiff style, and then takes, queen h5, go here, takes, there's like 0% chance you're not going to die within like the next 10 moves. So yeah, I was really ignorant to the g4 idea, or at the very least, I didn't think it was going to be as lethal as it was, where let's say a5 is what I played, g4, like I thought that maybe I could play bishop e8, g5, knight f d5, and like now they can't really take because my f7 pawn is protected, but after knight e4, you really need to take a step back and realize like, oh, my pieces are doing nothing. Like, I have a good looking knight in d5, maybe my bishop is protecting this square, maybe you could say this bishop isn't such a bad piece, but the rest of my pieces, like this rook has no life on the d file, it looks like it might be doing something, maybe it could, but at the moment it's not. This rook also is doing nothing, the queen doing nothing as well, my knight is hoping that this knight on d5 disappears, but it isn't apparent that that's going to happen anytime soon. And because of that, basically my position is absolutely almost losing, which might seem kind of crazy because material is equal. Seems like I haven't done anything too wrong. But the thing I did do terribly wrong, apart from like all this knight h5, queen b8 stuff earlier, was that I didn't pay attention again to like the nuance of the position where, like for example, if I did, I could have played bishop e8 here. And now if g4, notice how in the game what happened was this knight ends up having zero role in the game. Whereas if I go bishop e8, immediately g4, knight cd5, now I can swap this knight out from c7 in time, or if they go g4, I can, let's say, maybe take, go knight d5, and now I've got rid of like one less bad piece, and I've also made sure that, you know, white doesn't have an extra piece participating in the attack rather, which is, of course, good news for black. Again, though, unfortunately, did not do that after a5, g4. We should also consider b4. If white just goes knight e4, then we can exchange and kind of defend. But unfortunately, they do have this in between with g5, after which, again, we see this sort of Greek skiff sacrifice, and after some forcing moves, we're just down the exchange, and this is not really a position that I think black should play. But of course, after g4, bishop e8, even though material is equal, again, really, really not good. And I felt very compelled to try and create some sort of counterplay, but it just wasn't happening. I tried f5 because I realized if I just sat on the position and did nothing, eventually I'm just going to get swarmed with pieces like queen h5. A rook is probably going to lift in somewhere. I knew nothing good was going to happen for me. So I tried to do this, but it was ultimately too little too late. I think I played h6. There was this nice tactic though, if rook takes c7, and after this winning the pawn, I did think for a bit maybe I have sort of counterplay because of the weak sort of king, and maybe I can like try and like do some tricky shit along this diagonal. It wasn't happening though, and essentially I ended up in big trouble. I think after rook takes d8 as well, I had an idea in the game why I didn't want to play this over bishop takes d8, but honestly I forget the reason. The computer said this was better as well, so yeah, I can't really remember why I did not play rook takes d8. I had a reason, I just don't remember what it was. But yeah, whatever the case was though, my position ended up going downhill very quickly, and yeah, got crushed. So basically, again, coming full circle, where did I go wrong? Okay, well, first of all, again, the opening, really, this was a difficult moment. It's not like just my calculation was off. I calculated the right moves, I just couldn't really evaluate the lines correctly, or the positions rather. And then from here, my position still wasn't that bad, but I think probably I overestimated just how bad like this was, for example, and I ended up going for this really weird stuff. My time management was also awful. I spent like 40 minutes or something, like 30 minutes maybe, coming up with knight h5, and it made my position worse, which is just highlights that, you know, just because you think more about a move does not mean you're going to end up playing a better move. I might have said this on the channel before, but I had a friend growing up who they had a coach. I didn't really have a coach, but basically what their coach told them was something along the lines of, you know, if your opponent spends like 5-10 minutes thinking, that might mean they're thinking of a good move. If they spend like 15 minutes, okay, maybe they still are, but if they spend more than 20 minutes, they're off the rails and they're thinking of like Disneyland or some crap like that. So that was basically me in this game, where knight h5 just was not it. And then I was given a second chance at life with my opponent playing d4, but already, like, even though the computer says this is equal, I think that doesn't really tell the whole story, which is that I need to be very precise because of the previously dodgy moves I'd played to really keep the balance. Because if, you know, I'm not, and I end up doing what I did in the game, which is very careless, immediately I'm just in trouble. And, you know, I mean, obviously well done to my opponent for, like, g4 isn't like a secret idea. It's an idea I've played before with the isolated queen's pawn. I know it exists, but I just wasn't really paying attention, and most importantly, calculating everything move by move to figure out the differences between certain positions. I was being incredibly lazy, and I really did pay the price for that. So here were the results for the second round. As you can see on board 12, I was there on half a point, but unfortunately lost. And there were quite a few other upsets, like the 4th seed from India International Master ended up losing to Harry Press, and in general also just like the tournament was a complete mess. A bunch of the top seeds lost in round 1, but yeah, not too much more to say. I think, hope you guys enjoyed this. Leave any comments down below if you have any questions or anything of that nature, but yeah, hope you guys have a good one.